Welcome back to Season 3 of Activista Rise Up. I am Dr. Patricia Campos-Medina. You can listen to this conversation on all my social media platforms and Spotify and Apple Podcasts at Dr. Patricia Campos-Medina. So excited to be back to have these wonderful conversations of inspiration with all of you. This month, we are celebrating women's accomplishments, and we create the path forward for girls to be powerful, to be in their energy, and to build our movement forward. What a fitting way to start a new season of discussions of inspiration and activism than to celebrate the women that are trying to make change in our economy, in the ways our jobs are providing a living wage and a dignity for women in our economy. We are just coming out of 2 years of a pandemic. We have all made great sacrifices to be able to sustain our families, to be able to get our economy going and fight for social and racial justice in this country. The National Domestic Workers Alliance and the work that they have been doing on behalf of domestic workers in this country is at the center of how we're going to take care of our economy, but taking care of the human infrastructure that takes care of everyone else in our economy. When we invest in women's work, when we invest in domestic work, when we invest in the women who take care of our families, we invest in our welfare, in our future. So today I have amazing leaders who are working hard every day, who survive a pandemic, taking care of our children, our families, our elders, and with little care for themselves. We're able to survive, we're able to empower themselves, and are fighting now and every day to say that women's work ought to be dignified work. And if we're going to invest in our economy, we gotta invest in women. So to be able to have this conversation on International Women's Day, I am blessed to start my season 3 of Activista Rise Up with some amazing, powerful women from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and who are fighting right now, right here in New Jersey, but this is just one of their many fights that they're having around the country, to be able to enact rights for domestic workers. Domestic workers do the work that holds our infrastructure economy in this country. So to help us have the conversation about why improving the work of women, improving the work of domestic workers is an important part of our recovery after our 2 years of a pandemic, I have an amazing leader, Evelyn Saz, a domestic worker and organizer fighting to establish a domestic workers' bill of rights right here in New Jersey. And she's following on a tradition of many women who have been doing that for a long time. I also have Reena Arora, who is a representative from National Domestic Workers Alliance, who is supporting the effort of workers in New Jersey to establish a domestic workers' bill of rights. So I'm going to welcome them to join me, and we are going to engage in a conversation about what does it take to actually say that domestic work is key to our infrastructure economy, to investing in the human infrastructure, which is the care economy. So welcome, Evelyn and Reena. I'm so happy to have you in my third season, my first episode of Activista Rise Up. Thank you for joining me. Bienvenida, Evelyn, al show de Activista Rise Up.
Gracias.
Thank you for having us.
So, Activista Rise Up is a forum for leaders, for activists, to learn about movements, to learn about leaders, and how to get engaged. So, este episodio, Evelyn, es para los líderes de movimientos y de campaña para poder entender cómo activar nuestra fuerza comunitaria para apoyar a campaña justa como es la lucha por los trabajadores domésticos. So, primeramente, por favor, dígame quién eres tú, tu historia, cómo es que tú estás en esta campaña para lograr los derechos para los trabajadores domésticos en Nueva Jersey.
Bueno, hola, muchas gracias por permitirme estar en este espacio. Hola, Patricia, ¿verdad? Reena, que estamos acá. Mi historia, bueno, realmente es la historia de muchas mujeres que venimos como inmigrantes a este país, ¿verdad? No es una historia más común, ¿verdad? Soy salvadoreña, estuve muchos años involucrada al movimiento social en El Salvador, luchando siempre por los derechos. Cuando vengo a este país y me inserto a la economía de este país, me doy cuenta de que hay muchos derechos que se nos violentan en el caso de las trabajadoras domésticas. Y me hice la pregunta, bueno, yo estoy trabajando acá, soy un inmigrante y a pesar que yo traigo una experiencia de mi país, vengo a este país y lo que yo sé no lo puedo ejercer. Y como inmigrante y que no sé inglés, pues una de las oportunidades que encontré fue realizar labores como una trabajadora doméstica. Saqué mi licencia para cuidar adultos mayores y empecé a trabajar, pero me fui dando cuenta en la medida vaya pasando tiempo que mis demás compañeras carecían de muchos, pero de muchos derechos, ¿no? Y entre ellos no teníamos derecho a, después de las 40 horas, tener el overtime, ¿verdad? Y eso a nosotros, pues yo decía, si todos los trabajadores tienen esos derechos, ¿por qué las trabajadoras del hogar, de la salud en el hogar, no los tienen? Y por qué se nos prohíbe de repente estar en contacto con las otras compañeras. ¿Por qué no tenemos un seguro médico digno, verdad? Y casi siempre se nos hacía énfasis que si nos caemos haciendo alguna labor en la casa donde nosotros llegamos, pues, ¿quién iba a cubrir con esos gastos? ¿Verdad? Luego me di cuenta que la labor que hacíamos era tan importante que no era realmente valorada. Es así como me empiezo a integrar, ¿verdad? A descubrir, a conectar, ¿verdad? Con muchas organizaciones, incluyéndote a ti, Patricia, ¿verdad? Que fuiste muy importante en todo este proceso y fue así como yo encontré también a la Alianza Nacional de Trabajadoras del Hogar y me di cuenta que había una organización muy grande, ¿no? Que estaba luchando justamente por los derechos laborales de las mujeres, ¿verdad? Y por realmente elevar ese estándar, ¿no? Y entonces es así como estoy hasta este momento. Esa es parte de lo que hemos hecho acá y de la lucha que actualmente estamos librando en New Jersey.
Gracias, Evelyn. Vamos a hablar un poquito más después de la campaña y lo que está tratando de lograr. Reena, Evelyn talked a little bit about her own path towards connecting to NDWA. So can you tell us a little bit about you and how you get into this work and who WNDA is, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and how do you come to meet Evelyn and help her in her struggle to figure out how to find dignity on her job?
Hi. So I was a law student in New York. And at the time, the domestic workers were organizing there to pass the first Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in the state, in the US, New York. It was a 6-year-long struggle, and our law students helped to work on the bill, to write the bill. I had the privilege of representing my first domestic worker in a case for unpaid overtime, and I did so with organizers. And that was a kind of relationship that was very critical to provide that legal support while doing the organizing. And that was how I met some of the key leaders who have then gone on to in the domestic workers' rights movement, both in the U.S., across the country, and internationally. And I was so inspired by the women, and the conditions of work were so exploitative and the isolation was so severe that the power disparity was really just something unique, I think, in the workers' rights field. And I became, committed to this movement since that time. So that was around 2006. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance was born in 2007.
Yes.
Originally, we worked with different affiliate organizations across that were already organizing low-wage workers and some of the domestic workers. And then over time, the national organization has developed chapters in different states and done some of the organizing. So since the New York Domestic Worker Bill of Rights passed in 2010 and went into effect in 2011, we have gone on to since pass 10 domestic worker bill of rights in states and 2 in cities. And we continue to evolve and push forward for these rights. At the very base of why we need these bill of rights is that during the New Deal, FDR, when he signed the signature legislation federally that brought about most of the workplace laws that we have in place, including the Fair Labor Standards Act, domestic workers and farm workers were left out. Yeah. And so in every law, in many, many different parts of the law, you see that everybody is an employee except for a domestic servant. And they were this massive exclusion. It's not unique to the US, but it is part of both the vestige of slavery in this country, as well as the way that we do not, we devalue in a very sexist way caregiving work of every kind. So house cleaning, caring for elderly, caring for children is seen as women's natural work and not real work. So it's been very important for us to go through and change the laws to strike those exclusions and to include domestic workers equally to all other workers. Then, as we also started to pass these bills, we recognized that there are certain unique conditions to domestic workers because of working in private households and just the kind of conditions they have been subject to, that there were simple things like a weekly day of rest and meal and rest breaks that are not in the law and that are so necessary for the well-being and support. And as you so eloquently said, and this is one of our basic, slogans, is domestic work is the work that makes all other work possible. So if we didn't have domestic workers, if they all went on strike, our economy would stop. And so it's time, as Evelyn has talked about, it's really understanding the value of the work and putting those protections in place. And so New Jersey came about. I joined as a policy attorney with the National Domestic Workers Attorney after 10 years of representing workers with unpaid wage claims, now working on passing the policies and the bills and supporting our work and enforcing them. And I joined in last February and began working with Evelyn and to support our affiliate organizations in New Jersey pass this critical bill to strike the exclusions and to also give domestic workers a voice and the resources to enforce their laws and to improve their working conditions in a real and meaningful ways.
So it's so important. Thank you for giving context to the reasons why we need a domestic workers' bill of rights, not just in New Jersey, but everywhere. And it's because our system of labor laws created during, after the Great Recession and through the National Labor Relations Act, actually excludes protections to a certain group of workers, which was farm workers, and it was domestic workers in the South, which was mostly Black women that were tied to the domestic care economy. And that was actually a political choice that was made in the 1930s to get labor rights for white workers and in the manufacturing industry. So I thank you for elevating that, because sometimes we think that things just happen because they happen, but actually it was a political choice that was made in the 1930s to exclude work that was that work that was done by women of color at that time, or workers of color, which is the farm workers. And we're still dealing with that effect right now. So I want to elevate that. But nowhere, since the 1930s, we're seeing this great transformation of our labor relations systems right now, which you haven't seen since the 1930s in the Great Recession. And so that we are making that comparison is relevant. But the pandemic actually raised this issue of who is really essential and who is essential to sustaining our economy and our workplace relations, right? So it has been a difficult time for women in the care economy, that the women who take care of our kids, take care of our elders, who help us, professional women like myself, go to work and have a professional career. So in that reality, I think we're in a very very critical point of change where we can actually say domestic work is essential work and it needs to be regulated in the same manner as other forms of formal work. I want to ask Evelyn to actually share a little bit of how she felt unrecognized, or how was she essential and how she felt unrecognized during this period. So I'm going to switch a little bit to Spanish for a little bit. Evelyn, este tiempo de la pandemia hizo relevante y esencial el trabajo de los trabajadores domésticos. So, ¿cómo usted se sintió? ¿Cómo fue usted impactada durante esta pandemia? Ver cómo usted sobrevivió la pandemia y cuál fue su manera de cómo usted pudo resolver alguna de las dificultades que tuvo como trabajadora doméstica. ¿Perdió su trabajo? ¿Se enfermó? ¿Siguió trabajando? ¿Qué sucedió con usted durante ese periodo?
Bueno, sí, gracias por la pregunta, porque definitivamente fui impactada directamente por la pandemia. Creo que fui de las primeras que me contagié del coronavirus, cuando todavía no se sabía mucho de esta enfermedad. El impacto fue tanto en lo económico como también en lo emocional, ¿no? El bombardeo de noticias donde te enfermas del coronavirus es sinónimo de que te vas a morir, era impactante, ¿no? Sobre todo en la relación que guardo con mi familia y mis hijos. Definitivamente fue bien duro. Y sí me impactó en lo económico porque perdí mi trabajo. De hecho, yo me contagié del coronavirus trabajando, ¿verdad? Y en ese momento no sabía que estaba enferma. Y bueno, avisé a mi agencia, prácticamente le dije, me siento así, me mandan a la casa, y fue una lucha increíble, ¿verdad? Una lucha increíble porque nadie me daba una respuesta de qué podía ser, ¿verdad? Y quedé prácticamente en el aire, se puede decir, durante más de 4 meses porque fue fuerte, la verdad que fue muy fuerte. Y durante ese tiempo el temor también de salir, ¿no? Cuando ya estaba bien, el temor grande de salir, porque temía volverme a enfermar y obviamente enfermar a mi familia. ¿Cómo resolví esto? Bueno, definitivamente el haber encontrado, y lo digo muy de corazón, el haber encontrado a personas, ¿verdad?, que me orientaron, y que esa conexión, ¿verdad?, me haya llevado a empezar a descubrir cuáles eran mis derechos y qué podía hacer, esas ganas de conocer cuál era el marco legal que en New Jersey o en Estados Unidos protegían a las personas como yo, ¿verdad? Me di cuenta que no podemos, en el marco de todas las trabajadoras del hogar no podemos sindicalizarnos, eso me dolió mucho. Me di cuenta que estábamos como trabajadoras del hogar tan dispersas, pero encontré realmente una voz, y en este caso fue bueno, tú sabes, Patricia, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo fue eso realmente? Y luego encontré a la alianza, ¿verdad? Y la conexión esa fue genial para mí porque empecé a conocer mucho sobre los derechos. Yo conozco mucho los derechos de mi país, pero acá yo estaba en blanco. Yo decía, ¿y a dónde voy? ¿A quién le digo? Y esa cosa de estar desconectada fue tan dura, ¿verdad? Y me fui enrolando y eso me gustó, ir conociendo. Y sobre todo cuando yo miraba a una compañera trabajadora del hogar, ya sea que cuida niños o que hace limpieza, yo le decía, no, pero no estás sola, mira, hay una organización más grande que defiende, que quiere elevar el estándar de vida nuestro, ¿verdad? Mira, y de repente ver las compañeras que en desánimo me decían, perdí mi trabajo, ya no me están dejando entrar porque dicen de que puedo llevar el coronavirus. Yo me enfermé y ahora me sale una cuenta en el hospital súper grande. No tengo seguro médico. Eso realmente me dijo, Wow, Evelyn, realmente podés empezar a ver de qué podemos hacer acá. Entonces, esa fue la forma que yo realmente me puse, dije, a organizarnos, ¿no?
Quiero decirle a los que escuchan que conocí a Evelyn porque una organización estaba haciendo ayuda mutua, se llama Cosecha New Jersey, y ellos estaban ayudándose mutuamente a sobrevivir la pandemia, y es así como yo la conocí y empecé la hice parte de un estudio y aprendí un poco de su historia. So es un honor a tener la parte de esta discusión. Evelyn just shared a little bit about her own story, about how she had to survive the pandemic, how she actually got sick and didn't have health insurance. She got and the agony of not knowing and not knowing who to call, what her rights were, not calling her agency, and her agency didn't have any answers for her. So, Reena, how can you share with our listeners, why do you need a domestic bill of rights, domestic workers bill of rights in New Jersey or in the United States? Because the story that we just heard from Evelyn is about how there's really no protections for these workers that do the work of caring for our children or caring for our elders. Yet when they get sick, nobody takes care of them. So why do we need a domestic workers bill of rights, and what does it do?
The Domestic Worker Bill of Rights is necessary because just to, at the very basic level, put domestic workers at the same level and equal to other workers, to recognize that the work that they do is work and that they deserve basic, and that the home is a workplace just like everywhere else. And so the Bill of Rights would strike the exclusion and provide protections for discrimination and harassment. You are in an isolated situation. Your employer has so much power over you. Most domestic workers are women of color, belong to multiple protected categories, and there's no protection for discrimination and harassment for the work that they do. So there's no reason that these workforce that's primarily women of color shouldn't have these protections when they're afforded to all other workers in the state. Secondly, there's no protection for occupational health and safety. And this was a big issue that came out of the pandemic. And there was no guidance. We don't know. People don't think of the kind of work domestic workers do as being dangerous. But just like anything else, there's inherent dangers. And in the face of pandemic, it's really terrible that we don't even include these workers in the basic ideal that they deserve to have a safe and healthy working environment. And with that comes having guaranteed days off and having meal and rest breaks. And it's very simple things. So the Bill of Rights is necessary so people can have time. When workers get hired as domestic workers, they are very often not really told the full terms and conditions of their employment. They're sort of on call. Their salaries is sometimes subject to change, the hours. These employers are not well versed in keeping records and doing these things. So one of the big demands for our membership has been the guarantee of a written agreement, really listing out what are my duties and what are my rights and my benefits, and then giving workers an opportunity to negotiate that at the beginning of at the beginning of employment, right? So the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights guarantees that every domestic worker get a written agreement that lays out the pay, the hours, the duties, responsibilities, the days off, and it gives that opportunity for those things to be guaranteed in a written contractual form and given to the worker in the language of their choice. Along with that, and as we've seen, and especially listening to Evelyn's story in the pandemic, is if you are a live-in domestic worker and you lose your job, you also lose your home. You become houseless. So if you are terminated without notice, you are put in a dire situation. And their lack of social safety nets was a real problem that came up in the pandemic. So the Bill of Rights would guarantee if you are a live-in domestic worker, at least 4 weeks notice before you're terminated. And if you are a regular worker, at least 2 weeks. People need time. People are taking care of their own families. They are living paycheck to paycheck. And so if they're going to be terminated, that notice is so essential to be able to make sure that they can still afford. So these are, There's
Yeah.
so much
Yeah.
elementary basic rights. Why do we need them? It's basically, it's really, embarrassing and shameful that we have to have a law like this, that these are not things that are already rights that are given. And because we know that things are so hard to change, the Bill of Rights also creates a standards board where employers and workers can come together and continue to examine and make recommendations about what should be improved, and the legislature to consider these things, so that we're not having to run back and create whole new campaigns, that there's a real investment. And as Evelyn said, domestic workers cannot unionize, so they do not have that collective bargaining venue to ask for rights as things evolve. And the pandemic shows us so much can change, and we're living in a disaster world. And then the last thing it does, the Bill of Rights, is to give money to community organizations to help enforce the rights. And we saw this happen with New Jersey with paid sick and family leave. The bill was passed in 2009. 10 years later, Rutgers does a report, and nobody knows about the law that's not implemented. So a bill was passed to give money to the Department of Labor and to partner with the community-based organizations to do that outreach and education. That is even more critical in the domestic worker context, because it's our community groups that do a lot of work to build the trust and find domestic workers in these isolated communities. So we don't want the law just to be something that's in writing. We want workers to have access through community organizations to enforce their rights, and for that money and the dedication of the state to take this essential workforce who they've ignored for so long seriously and protect them, to really put dedicate those resources to it. So those are the key elements of the New Jersey Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, it's essential to know that, yeah, if you can pass a law, but if the workers don't know that it exists, it doesn't really change the dynamics of power within the employer and the employee. So what do you say to that argument that says, but why do we need a Bill of Rights when I hire my nanny and she's part of my family and I love her, and we just welcome her? And so what do you say to the people that said, that's my private relationship with that person? But as we learned from Evelyn, she works for an agency, and a lot of people do get it is a private relationship, but at the same time it's an employment relationship. So what is the answer to those who say, but I love my nanny and I have a personal relationship with them? Why are you getting in the middle of it?
Because they are workers. And let me tell you, all the employers, I hear this so often, they are not a member of your family. You are hiring them. You are an employer, and that is part of the culture change that needs to happen. Workers deserve to have basic workplace protections. They are doing hard work, and by calling them a member of the family, you're devaluing their contribution, and you're erasing their ability to have to do things. People sacrifice taking care of their own children to work in the homes of others and their own families, so that those people enjoy the benefits of having household employment. So it is a formal relationship. It is a working relationship. It is no different. And to say otherwise is actually an insult to the workers. And it's really something that employers need to understand. They are not members of your family. A member of your family can sit and waste time and be lazy. A worker who is in your home is going to work 10 times harder than they would even in their own home, because this is their job. This is their livelihood. This is what they depend on, and their families depend on for working, for survival.
Yes, exactly. And they need time off, and they need to rest, and they need the ability to go and take care of their families sometimes, and they need the support in between. What happens to arrangements in the family? So sometimes you do pay family member to take care of your relatives. Are those included in the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights?
No. So a family member would not be considered a domestic worker. New Jersey does have a kinship program where they do pay family caregivers in a more formal relationship. Those would also be excluded. I think we are recognizing as a society that the government should be supporting as we, as the baby boomers are aging and we have a growing aging population and growing numbers of people with disabilities, we are having a crisis of care infrastructure. There's going to be a growing demand for caregivers it's only increasing at an exponential rate. So we do support family caregivers to get support from the state to be employed in that manner. But if you are just hiring someone within the family, that is not considered an employment relationship. They wouldn't meet the definition of a domestic worker under our bill.
Yeah. Evelyn, le quería preguntar, cuando un empleador dice, pero ¿por qué yo te trato bien, yo te pago bien, ¿por qué necesitas una ley para que regule esta relación que tenemos, que es independiente de un empleador grande? Tú eres una trabajadora profesional doméstica, pero ¿qué tú contestas cuando te dicen eso? Si tú eres parte de la familia, ¿por qué necesitas más derechos?
Bueno, principalmente porque queda a discreción del empleador. Algunos pueden ser muy amables, ¿verdad? Pero esa amabilidad realmente esconde otras cosas. Por ejemplo, yo soy amable, pero tú me vas a hacer otra cosa, ¿no? Tú puedes, si estoy cuidando niños, por ejemplo, me pueden decir, sí, pero mira, puedes comerte la comida que quieres, siéntate ahí con el niño y ahorita yo no tengo quien me cuide al bebé y necesito que me limpies esto. Te van dando otras asignaciones que no te corresponde, ¿verdad? Y porque definitivamente queda a la discreción de ellos. No es como cuando ya se tienen términos por escrito, ¿verdad? O términos donde diga, tú vas a dedicarte a esto, tú vas a tener este horario. De repente te dice, no, a mí me pasó. Una persona, yo estaba cuidando a su mamá y ella me dijo, mira, Evelyn, fíjate que voy a ir a New York y necesito que te quedes un par de horas más con mi mamá. Y yo le dije que sí, ¿verdad? Que lo iba a hacer, porque al día siguiente ella me iba a dar como el tiempo, ¿no? Pero resulta que llegó a las 10 de la noche, a esa hora, ¿verdad? Y estaba lloviendo, está horrible. Resulta que yo le dije, eso fue miércoles, el viernes, por favor me das ese tiempo. El jueves ella me gritó y empezó a decirme que yo era una estúpida, que no hacía bien las cosas, y empezó a insultarme y decirme muchas cosas. Entonces yo le dije, si no estás conforme, pues entonces yo me retiro. Y sí, vete, me dijo que me fuera, yo me fui, pero no me firmó mis horas, no me repuso las 6 horas extra que hice, y entonces quedé así nomás. Entonces no tenemos realmente algo que nos ampare y diga, y que podamos poder, por ejemplo, un reclamo, ¿no? Una instancia que reciba el reclamo y que le den seguimiento, ¿verdad? Entonces, son de las situaciones que nosotros realmente enfrentamos, ¿verdad?
Evelyn just talked a little bit the arbitrary of the employment relationships, that if you don't have a contract, the employer sets the rules as they go along. Sometimes what are the instances of wage theft on domestic workers? I think I just read an article, I guess, about a settlement in New York State in which these were workers employed by agencies who actually were high levels of wage theft in this industry. So these are actual violations of the actual law when you refuse to pay people for time they have worked. So what are the violations that happen on the industry, Reena?
Yeah, so I used to recover wages on behalf of domestic workers, and it is basically, it's so common. I mean, whether, if in the way that wage theft occurs, the kind of claims for unpaid overtime, I mean, every industry is a little bit different, like sub-industries. Our nannies regularly not paid for their overtime. I have had represented workers with $50,000 to $60,000 worth of unpaid wage claims, up to $100,000, $200,000. That's a lot of money for a low wage worker, domestic worker. Our household cleaners, if they don't like the way the job is done, they don't pay. There's a lot of instances of not paying your last paycheck, your last month of pay. If they fire you, they just decide that they don't have to, because they feel the power differential is so great that they feel invincible. And one of the biggest problems that we have in the domestic worker in our industry is retaliation. So, if a worker makes a demand or just asks for, as Evelyn said, the terms keep changing, right? So if a worker says, okay, but you said that I was only doing house cleaning and now you've asked for me to take care of 2 children, like, can you increase my pay? Or I've worked for you for 5 years and you've had 2 other children, can you increase my pay? They'll say, oh, I'll report you to immigration. I will write a bad review to you to the agency. I will do this. And the way that the kind of threats that workers face when they try to stand up for their rights is really egregious. And so these employers definitely, there are good employers who want to do right, who just don't understand how to implement the law in the way that protects the rights. And then there are ones who will take advantage, and wage theft is very rampant in this industry. And workers feel a lot of fear. And if you are a nanny who's worked for a family for 10 years, you need a positive reference to find a new job. So to go back and recover your wages is extremely, it's an extremely risky decision, because then you could jeopardize your future employment. So, it's so important for us to be taking these cases seriously.
Yeah. So, what I'm hearing is instances of this, changes in the working conditions, because an employer can tell you this is what you're doing, and then all of a sudden change their mind and give you something else. So that's working the rules of the game as they go along. Unpaid wages, increasing work, and not higher accommodation. So all the things that, if you're in a regular workplace, wouldn't happen, they happen in someone's household, because it's a private relation, it's a one-on-one relationship with one person. So this is why I totally am with you in saying we ought to have a set of standards which the Domestic Bill of Rights sets for how these relationships and these agreements happen. So who opposes? Who is the opposition? Who would be opposed to having a set of standards that regular folks, because most folks, I think, want to do the right thing, like you said, but there's some people who don't, and it's like a spiral effect. So who opposes actually creating rights for domestic workers? Who is at our position on this bill, and what can we do about, like, being louder about the need for having some set of rules that give a little bit more power to workers in this industry?
I mean, we have the visible opposition and then the invisible opposition.
Yeah.
I have represented workers in cases in court, in federal court, state court, everything. And the reality is that a lot of our legislators and our judiciaries are employers of domestic workers, and there's a lot of fear about what it means to give workers these rights. So sometimes there's an invisible opposition to giving anti-discrimination protections, this idea of consumer choice. We should be able to decide who we let into our home. No, that is workplace discrimination. And so that is a hard thing to fight against, because people don't want to be vocal about it, but there's a lot of nervousness around what it means. And that's where a lot of education needs to be given to dispel this notion of, that these are not workers and the home is not a workplace. Our visible opposition is largely coming from agencies who bring about what are called au pairs. So au pairs are domestic workers who are part of what is called the J1 visa cultural exchange program. This is an immigration program run by the U.S. State Department. They come here for 2 years, and they get a visa, and they are told that they have to do up to 45 hours of in-home childcare, and they are live-in domestic workers. And live-in domestic workers are the most vulnerable. There are all kinds of violations when it comes to privacy rights and then recording of hours and all of these pieces, because you live with the family. So the agencies, the law is very clear that, state labor laws and federal labor laws apply to au pairs because they are performing work. But the au pair agencies are claiming that if they are included in the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, they're going to go out of business. That's not true.
Not true at all. Yes. Yeah.
Domestic workers in New Jersey are already entitled to minimum wage, to overtime.
Yes,
Nothing about this bill changes those rights. It's about getting the agreements, getting the breaks, getting protections for discrimination and harassment. But there is a philosophy, and they are huge profit, multi-million profit agencies that make a lot of money through this program. So they're the ones who don't want to see this bill pass. But there's no reason that any Democrat, progressive, anyone with any kind of basic principles about labor would be in opposition to this bill.
Well, they shouldn't be, because what we have to remember, and we have to remind people and elected officials and all consumers, is that if you are hiring anyone to help you take care of your children, you're hiring anybody to help you take care of your parents, they are workers. They're working for you, and therefore they're entitled to all the protections of any other worker. So I think that we have to elevate and change the narrative that this is a choice that I make to hire or let somebody into my home. You're actually hiring somebody, so therefore you are an employer. That you have responsibilities towards that worker. And I wanna, for full disclosure, I did have an au pair for a couple of years when my children were young, and I will tell you, I am very conscious about the rights, but I was very good about following the law. But I will have stories, because she will bring all these other au pairs to stay with us, of real terrible treatment from the families who were hosting them. And I couldn't believe that was happening. And I used to tell my au pair, and we're still having a close relationship with her, I couldn't believe that there's actually people who do abuse that relationship, of having somebody live in their home and help you take care of your kids, because that is a gift, as someone who was trying to like have a career and manage my two children. I felt that somebody helping me take care of my kid was a gift, and my job was to be able to comply to the contract that I had signed for them to be able to do that. So I want to elevate that we all have a responsibility in that relationship to be able to do that for workers, because when you get any worker, whether they're coming from another country or they're immigrants living here, they are trying to do a job. So we have a commitment to pay to meet to that. So Evelyn, before we finish this this broadcast, because we're almost getting to the 50-minute mark, ¿qué usted le puede decir a alguien que dice, pero ¿por qué necesitas esta ley? ¿Por qué es importante para ti, si has podido salir adelante en este país? ¿Por qué necesitas más protección como una trabajadora doméstica?
Le diría 3 palabras que encierran un gran concepto. Y la primera palabra es esperanza, porque también tenemos derecho a soñar, que merecemos una mejor vida en este país, realizando un trabajo tan importante que permite a las familias poder también salir a trabajar mientras dejan al cuidado de nosotras. Diría que por justicia, porque es un reclamo, ¿verdad?, que nosotros hacemos a las autoridades que durante años y décadas nos han dejado excluidas de un marco legal que garantice mínimamente nuestra labor y mejorar nuestro estándar. Y la última sería por dignidad, ¿verdad? Por dignidad, porque siento que nos han arrebatado, ¿verdad?, nuestra dignidad. y necesitamos que nos la devuelvan. Por eso es que muchas trabajadoras del hogar como yo, rompemos el silencio, nos armamos de valor y vamos a Trenton, ¿verdad? A visitar a los legisladores, y muchas de las compañeras rompen su temor y hablan con ellos. Muchas de nosotras no tienen un estatus migratorio acá legal y eso les da temor. Sin embargo, a pesar de eso, el pensar que vamos a mejorar nuestra calidad de vida y que nos van a devolver nuestra dignidad nos hace fuertes. Entonces eso contestaría, por eso.
Reena, how many domestic workers are in New Jersey?
There are 50,000 domestic workers in New Jersey, and that includes house cleaners, nannies, as well as caregivers.
And I would say to all our listeners that if you are a working middle-class New Jersey family or a middle-class American, your ability to do your profession or or be able to have a job outside of the home is because of the work that domestic workers do to help you do that. So how can people of good conscience, people who want to support this campaign, how can they support domestic workers in New Jersey to get this bill through the legislature and make it into a law? So can you tell me a little bit about the bill, the campaign, and how people can get engaged? Reena.
Yes. So the first thing you should do is call your representative in the Assembly and the Senate and ask them to pass the bill. Right. So the first thing is to call your assembly person or your senator and demand that they pass the New Jersey Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. To look at our website, domesticworkers.org. Sign up for alerts and updates, and that will tell you how to stay involved. If you are an employer, our organization that we work with called Hand in Hand is an organization of employers of domestic workers, and they have a petition in support. And so it's very critical to get the support of employers of domestic workers. And then you can also text ACT, ACT, 33843 exclamation point. And that will allow you to connect with and how to support the passage of this law.
And all to our listeners, all this information is going to be on our website, on our social media. And please take action. Evelyn, antes de irnos, ¿por qué le da esperanza que vamos a lograr pasar esta legislación? ¿Qué le da esperanza a usted?
¿Qué nos da esperanza? Realmente es porque somos muchas trabajadoras del hogar y es porque realmente nos estamos haciendo escuchar, ¿verdad? Y queremos que nuestra Carta de Derecho sea vista, escuchada, leída, tomada en cuenta. Entonces eso me da la esperanza, que estamos organizándonos fuertemente para luchar por nuestra dignidad a través de la Carta de Derecho y que no estamos solos. Hay muchas organizaciones que nos están apoyando. Tenemos una coalición que está trabajando, la alianza, y bueno, hay muchos que están detrás de esto, que no estamos solas, ¿verdad? Que las trabajadoras del hogar ahora tenemos voz propia, pero también hay un respaldo de estas instituciones. Entonces, eso.
Lo que me da esperanza es ustedes organizadas. What gives me hope is all of you organized, coming together and saying our job is important work. It builds the framework for our economy to work, and we're essential, and we demand our rights. So I am so proud and honored to know you, to help, to support this effort. And I call on everyone to please, whether you are you are an employer of domestic workers, whether you are a supporter of domestic workers, a supporter of workers and social justice in general, please take action. Come to our website, sign our petition in support of the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in New Jersey. Take action, because just like Evelyn said, their hope, la esperanza de ellas, their hope is that they're organized and they are making their voice heard. So, but also their hope is that you will take action to support them. So please come together. We are activists. We are change makers, and if we take action together, we can make change happen. So visit NWDA website, sign the petition in support of the New Jersey Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, visit Activista Rise Up, come together and support domestic workers in New Jersey, to support domestic workers around the country, and together we were gonna make our human infrastructure the core of our economic recovery after this pandemic. I am Dr. Patricia Campos-Medina. I am here to have these conversations, to inspire you to take action and help workers like Evelyn make change for better for all of us. Thank you. Take action, Activista Rise Up.